Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The mighty Imperial class Star Destroyer. It's amongst the most beloved ships in the Star Wars galaxy. Its iconic triangle shape dates back to the ancient Sith Empire's designs, and in the modern Imperial era, its designers wanted to instill as much fear into the hearts of the Empire's enemies that none would ever dare to step out of line. Otherwise, this 1,600 meter long, 900 meter wide monstrosity would park itself in low orbit and block out your local star and point all 60 of its turbo laser batteries down onto the planet. One interesting side note is that thanks to its triangle-shaped hull and tiered arrangement of turbo lasers, the ISD was able to point all of its weapons forward and fire at the same time, getting massive amounts of plasma, superheated plasma, onto target. That's what this whole design was all about. And once your target city has been replaced by a crater or some kind, the Imperial class Star Destroyer could just deploy its legions of stormtroopers, AT-ATs, and AT-ST walkers. Heck, they even had prefabricated bases that could just be dropped onto the planet and arranged within a few hours. Herein lies the true purpose of the Imperial class Star Destroyer. Yes, it was designed to instill fear into the hearts of the Empire's enemies, but it was also created to serve as a forward base of operations for any type of military action the Empire might want to carry out. And so the ISD was very much central to the Empire's naval doctrine, and the 25,000 ISDs that Emperor Palpatine would construct would form the backbone of that navy. But the Imperial class Star Destroyer was also the perfect symbol of Palpatine's arrogance. It was a massive and resource-intensive ship, and it could only really function with a logistical tail that rivaled its massive frame and size. The ISD, like so many things within the Imperial fleet, was perched atop of a fragile pyramid of logistics and support. When one part of the structure was removed, the entire system could collapse, rendering the entire Imperial fleet inoperable. And that is, of course, one of the greatest threats the Empire actually face. Now, before we get there, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, saber.com. They make these awesome lightsabers. And right now they have an awesome Halloween special. Anyone who buys a replica saber gets a free Jedi or Sith robe of their choice. Just add both items to the cart and the price will be updated at checkout. This offer ends on October 22nd, but if you want your robe to arrive before Halloween, we do recommend you order it before October 18th. saber.com has a wide range of seriously awesome looking and hard to find lightsabers. For instance, they have the Chimera, which is Ezra Bridger's blade. I like to call it the staple gun. They also have Kanan Jarrus' blade. You might recognize that circular hilt guard as the one Professor Huyang gives Ezra. So guys, if you want to get your hands on one of these awesome lightsabers or that Jedi robe, check out the description down below. Also, you can use our promo code EWOK, that's all caps, for an additional $15 off of your purchase. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. The Galactic Empire ruled over 1,000 different sectors, and in each one of those sectors you had at least 50 habitable planets. Each sector was appointed a sector fleet, and these were usually built around a handful of these Imperial-class Star Destroyers. The Lothal sector, for instance, had 6 Imperial-class Star Destroyers plus some supporting ships. Now, this was an outer rim sector far away from the more important core regions, and generally a sector like Lothal would not have such a large military presence, but ever since Price Mining uncovered large dunium deposits on the planet, it became a focus for Imperial security. Dunium was a heavy metal that was extremely important for ISD reactors, and also one of the key elements needed to produce the gigantic focusing dish for the Death Star. And so Lothal went from being a backwards world that no one really knew about to one of the key sources of dunium in the galaxy for the Imperial Industrial Military Complex. And soon after, Senior Fleet Systems would also develop a large industrial complex on the planet to do research and development for the TIE Defender program. This is why Lothal had such a large sector fleet, and why later on Thrawn's 7th Fleet would also be redirected to this planet. The 7th is what you guys would call a reserve unit. It's deployed by Imperial High Command to trouble spots. And so a reserve fleet doesn't have a home sector that it usually defends. It's just like reinforcements for any kind of trouble spot. And Thrawn was a special kind of guy, and so his 7th Fleet was massive. It had 9 Imperial 1 class Star Destroyers and 16 Imperial 2 class Star Destroyers, along with at least 6 Victory class Star Destroyers, which were really good for orbital bombardment. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's a lot of ships with a lot of personnel, but really, you know, if each ship has about a legion or 1 division of infantry, that's about, 20, 30 divisions of soldiers. That's roughly the same size that most larger national military forces have here on Earth. The US Army, for instance, has anywhere from 10 to 20 active divisions, whereas a more manpower-heavy country like China might have 10 to 3 times that number. And if we were to combine all of the different military forces on Earth together, we would have hundreds and hundreds of divisions. And so with 6 Star Destroyers, I would say the Lothal Sector fleet had just about enough forces to maintain some type of peace on the entire planet, and when Thrawn's 7th fleet came into the system, they had just about enough manpower to occupy a planet of this size. You know, keep in mind, Lothal is a small planet, has a smaller population than Earth. Maybe has, I don't know, a few million to tens of millions of people, but no more than that. Just imagine how many more troops you would actually need to conquer a planet like Coruscant, which had a population of a few trillion. Suddenly, Thrawn's 7th fleet, with its 25 Star Destroyers, 25 legions, doesn't seem that large of a military force. The Empire was always facing a huge uphill battle, and that's perhaps why Emperor Palpatine adopted the Tarkin Doctrine. Instead of trying to appease the population or control them through direct force, Palpatine tried to use fear, which ultimately backfired in its own spectacular way. Now, one of the major problems that occurred shortly after his death was the complete collapse of the Imperial logistics system. Remember, Palpatine's ultimate goal with the Clone Wars and his Emergency Power Act was to consolidate as much of the Republic's resource-gathering potential and industrial might beneath federal control as possible. This nationalization effort was central to the Emperor's economic policy. Whenever a country nationalizes something, the idea is to redirect revenue that normally would go to the private sector into government coffers, and at the same time give government more control over these industries and how things are priced and manufactured. For instance, you could be heavily dependent on rice for, one of the major foods for your nation. And so by controlling rice production, you can make sure it's affordable for the average family, which increases overall stability for your government. Generally speaking, private companies are more flexible and efficient compared to public-run companies. They have the ability to quickly adjust to market demand and the price of labor and raw materials. Ideally, if you're a defense contractor, you're not just building products for the military, you also have products for the commercial and civilian market. This way, you can have additional streams of revenue that can help fund your research and development or upgrade your factories, right? It's about diversifying things so you don't rely on just one source of income. Boeing is a great example of this. It's one of the largest defense contractors in the United States, but more than 70% of its business is foreign, and a good percentage of it is focused on developing commercial airliners and helping maintain them. This means whatever revenue that Boeing makes from these other sales will go into maintaining the personnel, the technology, and the manufacturing capabilities of Boeing, and basically keeping it out of reach of smaller competitors who just can't scale up their operations the same way without those civilian contracts. The fact that Boeing builds all of these commercial liners and also builds state-of-the-art military aircraft like the FA-18 Super Hornet or the AH-64 Apache Longbow or the V-22 Osprey is what makes it such a powerful company. Now, having said that, is Boeing a terrific company? Is it something I would invest in? Probably not. It has a lot of problems because it's so heavily dependent on those military contracts. But let's compare Boeing to Newport News Shipbuilding, for instance. Newport News Shipbuilding really just focuses on one thing, and that is overhauling Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and also building the next generation Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carriers. Now, these new aircraft carriers are going to be ridiculous. The United States does not have a near peer when it comes to power projection beyond its own borders, thanks to its carrier strike groups, which in some ways function just like an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, but it's even more flexible because it's centered around a carrier and not a battleship. But these aircraft carriers are also going to be dumb expensive. The Nimitz already costs around $4.5 billion each, and the Ford is going to cost around $13 billion. And the reason why this is because for now there's only 2 planned Gerald R. Ford class aircraft carriers being built. There's basically no scale, and what's worse, Newport News Shipbuilding does not have a large commercial operation that it can depend on for more money to lower its overall operation and production costs. And so Newport News Shipbuilding is not building like 30 different hulls a year, it's only building 1 or 2 for these aircraft carriers. Now, I have to say, it's a little bit unfair for me to pick on this company. The bigger issue with this is that America just doesn't have the domestic capability to build large ships anymore. Costs are way too high. A lot of that business has either gone over to Europe or, more importantly, over to Asia, to like South Korea and China. And perhaps equally as importantly, you're just not going to ever scale up aircraft carriers. You're never going to need more than like a dozen. The US has almost a dozen already, and its combined deck space is twice as much as all of the other nations' aircraft carriers combined. If anything, the US aircraft carrier reminds me more of the Super Star Destroyer employed by Emperor Palpatine. These were 19-kilometer long starships, much larger than just an ISD, and the Empire also usually only had a dozen or so of these. And that's because they're so costly to produce, manufacture, and maintain. See, Palpatine understood the economics of scale. If you have just one main fighter platform, one main battleship platform, one main blaster to produce, you can significantly decrease the cost of manufacturing that item if you place huge orders for them. You know, Quad Drive Yards most likely could produce an Imperial class Star Destroyer for, I don't know, 200 million credits cost, and then maybe they'll sell it for 250 million credits. You know, you have to factor in all the marketing they're gonna do. They probably have teams of lawyers to make sure that everything fits the treaties the Republic has for building warships, right? It also would have to recoup billions of credits in research and design, which has to be spread out through how many units you're actually gonna sell. If you're only gonna sell 100 ISDs, they're gonna have to be a lot more expensive than if you can stretch that R&D to maybe 10,000 platforms, right? You have to look at how many new materials were developed for this ship, how many new dockyards and factories were made to build all of these new parts, like the massive ion engines. Now, Quad Drive Yards could hire a third-party vendor like Corellian Engineering Corporation to develop these ion engines, but that would mean paying them some kind of middleman fee, design fee, and other kind of things. Now, if Quad Drive Yards is focused on long-term domination of the shipbuilding market and not just focused on, I don't know, paying back its shareholders in the short term, it'll probably want to vertically integrate everything, as in create in-house design and manufacturing and engineering for every piece of that Star Destroyer, from the thrusters to the hyperdrive. But still, that 250 million credit price point is what the Quad Drive Yard finance people have estimated to be the price point in which KDY can recoup all of its investments into the project, and that is probably because they've determined they can only sell a few hundred or a few thousand of these. Now, when you're building these big ticket items as a defense contractor, you already probably know how many you're going to sell of these. I mean, an Imperial class Star Destroyer is so large, you could really only have a few core worlds that could afford to buy and maintain and, you know, make these things run properly. And so the best case scenario for a company like Quad Drive Yards is for the Empire to say, hey, I want you to custom design this ship according to my specs, and I will guarantee to order, say, 1,000 of these Star Destroyers. If you have 1,000 guaranteed offers and the Empire is willing to front a lot of that money ahead of the purchase, you can start building a lot of this new infrastructure to actually fit this order. Well, actually, Empire would not just order 1,000, they would order 25,000, and so I'm sure Quad Drive Yards greatly expanded their manufacturing capabilities as a result. And so instead of relying on a third party to create Durasteel, maybe they could just start mining the ore themselves and processing that ore into Durasteel and cut out the middleman. As a matter of fact, that's what Quad Drive Yards did for almost everything. It would actually start creating its own ion engines. It would have its own internal propulsion division. It would have its own weapons division, and so on. And they also kind of had to, because no one was making components as large as what the ISD needed in the first place. It was just too big of a ship. And this is basically what expanded Quad Drive Yards to a massive size. It was these just historic military contracts that were bigger than anything the galaxy had ever seen. Oh, and they also probably saved on labor because the Empire looked the other way when it came to employing slaves. This was really Palpatine's main goal. It was to create as large and as cheap of a military force as possible, and at the same time, make the average citizen's livelihood heavily dependent on the military-industrial complex. There actually was an economic boom when the Empire started some of these programs like the ISD, because so much money was flooding into these companies, and they were hiring so many people to fill out these orders. But then again, even once these ships were built already, you still needed a lot of people working to maintain these ships and, you know, keeping the supplies flowing. When former Imperial Governor Every Chalice defected to the rebellion and started advising Twilight Company on how they can really damage the Empire, she said the following: Star Destroyers may be nearly indestructible, but they're the most resource-intensive ships this galaxy has ever seen. Quad possesses the only shipyard capable of supporting and maintaining more than a handful at a time. And so Governor Chalice's recommendation to the rebellion was not to fight the Empire at all face to face, but instead weaken their fleet by attacking their logistical tail, which was usually not as well defended. If they could disrupt the mighty ISD from operating at full capacity, they could also delay the arrival of Imperial stormtroopers on newly liberated worlds for weeks, if not months at a time. You see, while the Empire did a great job at ramping up its manufacturing capabilities to build all of these Star Destroyers, they still didn't have enough refueling depots and resupply depots out in the Outer Rim, where a lot of the fighting was actually going. And the facilities that were available were probably too small to properly refit an Imperial-class Star Destroyer very quickly, and so instead you had to rely on smaller ships ferrying supplies onto the ISD, or you had the ISD park at some type of refueling platform like the one we see on Peridia with the Chimera. But this kind of resupplying was really slow. Instead of large trucks or ships lifting gigantic containers into the ISC, you had to basically unpack and remove a lot of these things, and sometimes it could take as much as, 3 rotations to move a bunch of caskets onto an ISD, and that just was not quick enough. And then there's the issue of feeding and supplying that legion of stormtroopers. I mean, it's hard enough to take care of an entire division of soldiers on a permanent base where you have, weekly or daily shipments of food from vendors that you can trust and supply. But when you actually deploy these 10,000 soldiers into a combat zone, which is basically what happens when you have an ISD, it becomes even tougher to make sure you have a stable line of food and supplies. Now, during normal times, when maybe you have 1 or 2 engagements in the galaxy each day, the Galactic Empire's logistical network had the ability to refit 1 or 2 Star Destroyers a day. That was fine. But at the height of the Galactic Civil War, especially after the Battle of Endor, when you had dozens of engagements with Imperial-class Star Destroyers each day, and while most of these ships would not get destroyed and only suffer some minor damage, they all had to be refitted and refueled and restocked. And with only a handful of shipyards as large as Quat and Fondor, suddenly you started having backlogs in Imperial-class Star Destroyer resupplies. Soon you had sector fleets that were missing maybe 20% to 30% of their ships due to this problem. And I'm sure pretty soon admirals start saying, well, okay, don't go back to Fondor, don't go back to Coruscant where you have to wait in line to get resupplied. Maybe we'll just do an essential resupply and focus on the systems that are essential for this ship to fly in battle. But because these ISDs are not fully supplied, they'll now function at a percentage of their normal capacity, and they'll be more vulnerable to enemy attack. And if you scale this problem up from just 1 fleet to the entire fleet, you're going to start to see the degradation of Imperial naval power, and it's something that will only go in one direction. You see, the Imperial Navy was never designed for a galaxy-wide war. It was designed to be a ceremonial fleet that stunned people into submission. But Palpatine never expected to see this gigantic fleet engage in battle day after day. The fleet, and more importantly, its logistical network, was never supposed to be tested in this way. At the same time, the Rebellion, which had really avoided more bold conventional attacks against the Empire, was ramping up their own offensives and cutting off entire systems and destroying Imperial supply depots, shipyards, and trade hubs as a result. And soon it wasn't about how long it took to restock a Star Destroyer, it was whether it was even possible to do it, and that created even more problems. The thing is, when an ISD goes through 2 or 3 battles, it might suffer some minor damages and still function within, 90% of its original capabilities, but after 10 battles with no repairs, suddenly you're gonna have holes in the armor, perhaps entire parts of the ship that are not covered by the remaining shield generators. You're gonna have a percentage of weapon systems offline or destroyed. You might also only have a small contingent of TIE fighters as well. I mean, just look at how cautious Thrawn was after being left on that planet of Peridia for 10 years without resupply. And so now your ship is still a mile long, and it's still a huge target, but you really don't have the defensive capabilities to protect that ship. And so you're gonna start changing how you interact with the New Republic defense fleet. Instead of being extremely aggressive and pressing the rebels, you're gonna be on the run now. I mean, do you think Moff Gideon is using a light Imperial cruiser because he doesn't have access to an Imperial-class Star Destroyer? Well, I think the light cruiser is easier to outfit and attracts a lot less attention than an ISD. It's actually a really smart move for Moff Gideon to use this ship, especially in the Outer Rim territories. So for a lot of the fans out there for the ISD, I'm sorry, you gotta understand that most military engagements are not about how large your ships are or how big the guns on them are. It's really just about your logistical capabilities. If you have very robust logistics, you can afford to lose a few battles, but in the long run, you most likely will win the war because of your economic and commercial might. That's what really separates a superpower from a regional power. You can have thousands of tanks and thousands of aircraft, but if you can't project that force further than 100 miles from your own borders and keep your soldiers supplied and well fed, you just aren't a superpower. For me, what's always been so impressive about the US military was not its massive fleet of tanks and fighters and aircraft carriers, its advanced technology, but its ability to operate a Pizza Hut and Subway in Afghanistan at Bagram Airfield. thousands of miles away from the mainland. Or the Army's ability to provide hot meals in just the craziest and most remote places on the planet. Such logistical capabilities are unheard of in human history, and this is really what separates the US military from other countries and why it's really the only superpower from a military projection standpoint. Now, because it has such logistical capabilities, it also means that the US military force is extremely vulnerable, just like the Empire. And that's because if that logistical tail is being targeted properly by its enemies, well, suddenly all those really beautiful and big machines stop working. And that's exactly what happened to the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy,